Starting with lesson 22, talk about Daniel 6 and the lion's den. So many times the devil will create, I already have my first typo here, jealousy towards those who love God. He seeks to destroy people that cannot, so that they can't bring more people to God. So this was the case with Daniel. Once again, he'd had an experience like this before, of course, with King Nebuchadnezzar, and now we're seeing it again with King Darius. So because Daniel was full of the Holy Spirit and was loyal to God, he had many gifts and was trusted even by the Babylonian, Persian, and Medes kings. So Daniel was made an administrator, along with two others, over 122 governors throughout the entire kingdom. So the two other administrators were jealous of Daniel, who was an outsider, a Hebrew. Remember, usually there's a lot of nepotism usually with these kind of jobs. You would have a king would hire like his closest family. Why? So he'd be less paranoid, right? If you put your brothers or your cousins or someone like that, there's less likely a chance that they're going to overthrow you. But to put an outsider like a Hebrew, especially these, the Hebrews were pretty much brought in like slaves. They were taken from their own country. So to have a Hebrew, the other two administrators didn't like that, and of course they were jealous of Daniel because of how much the king trusted him. So they tried to find a way to get rid of him, and they were trying to look for a way to exploit him. Of course, they couldn't find any like weaknesses of his. He didn't break any laws. He was a good person. So the only thing that they found that was his weakness was God, and they later see that God is actually his strength, not his weakness. So they plotted to convince King Darius to make a new law that anyone who worshipped anyone other than the king would be thrown into the lion's den. So the king agreed. Of course, kings have big egos, and so Daniel continued praying to his God 3 times a day, as he always did. And the king, because he made the law, so he can't go back on it, he was reluctant, but he had him thrown into the lions. So Darius, the king, knew that Daniel's God would protect him. He even tells him, "Don't worry, go in the king. Into the den. Your God will protect you." But after he does that, the king, remember, who's a pagan. He's not a Christian. Well, there were no Christians. He wasn't a Jew, a Hebrew, but he goes and keeps a fast and keeps a vigil all night so that God would protect Daniel. So we see that this pagan king already has faith in God. So King Darius sealed the den with the seal of his ring. So what he would do, they probably put some kind of seal on it, and he put his ring on it so that you couldn't open it up without the seal being broken. And he did this for 2 reasons, according to the church fathers. One, so that there would be no rumors that Daniel was rescued from the den, and then credit would not go to God. And 2, that Daniel's enemies would not be able to go into the pit to ensure his demise, because there were more wild beasts than the lions. And remember, there was also a similar thing with Jesus going into the tomb. The Jews went to Pilate and said, "Let's secure the grave so that no one comes and seals him," and then says he was raised by the dead, or from the dead. So we see kind of similarities in those ways. After finding Daniel alive the next morning, King Darius had Daniel's accusers, the other 2 administrators, along with their children and wives and the whole thing. And I left that out of this explanation because sometimes people have a really hard time with that. It's like, killed his children too? But he threw them all into the lion's den and declared that all should worship the God of Israel. So it begins to become more apparent that God is not only the God of the Jews, but of all people. And we've seen that a couple times, but now we're getting closer and closer to the coming of Christ. We're about 500 years away to the coming of Christ. So, if we go to the blue box, we talk about conversion through action. You know, a lot of times we talk about how to talk about God to other people so that we can bring people to God. But really, the best way to convert people is through our own actions. So Daniel brought many non-Jews to faith in God through his faith and actions. He especially brought several kings to believe in the God of Israel. Daniel didn't bring these people to faith in God through his words, but through his actions, because he truly believed in God. His actions matched his faith, and people were inspired. So if you really believe in something, you live your life in a way to reflect that, right? If you are a doctor who teaches people to live healthy, but you're a huge person who smokes and doesn't do what he says, what's that telling the patients? Well, that's not really all that important, right? Even if the doctor truly believes it is, by not doing it himself, he's giving that impression that, well, this isn't really all that important. But if you have a doctor or a nutritionist who's fit and takes care of their body, that's more an advertisement for what he's saying or she's saying than just the words that they say. Because I mean, obviously, you look at someone like that, and if they're huge, you're gonna say, well, obviously, whatever they're doing is not working. So with Daniel, if he was just talking a good game, kind of like the Pharisees did in Jesus' time, right? But they weren't doing anything to back it up, then what does it mean? It means nothing. So the Pharisees weren't bringing people to God. They were probably making people leave God. So if we only preach God with our mouths, we'll have a hard time convincing anyone that God is real. The martyrs of the church convinced the most people to believe in God because they believed in him so much that they were willing to die for him. So the word martyr, by the way, in Greek, martyria, means a witness. That's what a martyr is. It's a witness. So we have like Saint Thecla. We call her a proto-martyr, one of the first martyrs. But she was actually not killed for her faith, but she was willing to be killed for her faith. So she went, and the kids that go to the village know this story well because they read it over there. But Saint Thecla, they tried to kill her several times, and she was willing to die for her faith, but God didn't allow her to die. But she's still a martyr because she was a witness. So we don't have to make grand gestures like entering a lion's den for God. Like I tell couples in pre-marriage counseling, or when I tell the teens about how to find a spouse, we have to love each other. And even though Bruno Mars says, I'll jump on a grenade for you, that's a nice thing to say, but how many grenades are being thrown in downtown Charleston for us to jump on to save our wives or husbands from, right? So those grand gestures are cute, and if we say them, that's one thing, but if we actually act on them, so how do we act on them? So we're probably, most likely in our lifetimes, although it's yet to be seen, but we're probably not going to be asked to be killed for God. Now, maybe if we lived in Syria or somewhere else in the Middle East, maybe. But here, for the most part, we can easily say, yeah, I'll die for God. But what's that mean? That means dying for him means dying on a daily basis, killing our will for him. So these are our everyday actions to identify as Christians. So are we afraid to pray in public? Do we give in to social pressure and accept things just to fit in? Then how can we expect to bring people to God? We need to be like Daniel and not care what anyone will think of us or what they'll do to us other than God himself. And God says that. Jesus says that. Don't fear man who can only kill the body, but fear God who can both kill the body and the soul, right? So, again, God's words, not mine. So Ezekiel, they pull, again, there are all these chapters that are listed in the children's Bible, and it's just like one page covering all these. So it's really not clear from what they have in there. I don't know kind of why they put that together the way they did. And if you want to skip over that part altogether in your class, I guess you could read it. It wouldn't hurt anything, but it is a little complicated. The prophet and priest Ezekiel lived and wrote in Babylon during the Jews' exile. So he was he was in Babylon. And Ezekiel was not just a prophet, he was also a priest. The prophecy, as it is found in the children's Bible, is not complete and jumps around quite a bit, as I mentioned to you. To understand these visions would take a great deal of time, as every piece can be explained symbolically. Instead, the big picture is that Ezekiel is prophesying the rebuilding of the temple, which the Jews would understand to mean that they were returning home. So remember, the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, and they would start rebuilding it about 70 years later. And so during that time, Ezekiel is prophesying, and it happens, even his prophecies happen over different times. So even in the children's Bible, you'll see the different time periods that he continues the prophecy. We jump to Isaiah. Isaiah is one of my favorite prophets. He has tons of beautiful prophecies. So this chapter 40, which they are talking about here, is telling the Jews that their time in exile was coming to an end, but its true purpose is a preparation of the people of Israel for the coming of the Lord. So again, each verse of this prophecy would need to be examined and interpreted carefully, but looking at the big picture, it's a prophecy about the coming of Christ. So again, if I went into every single verse and explained it, I'd write a book. One thing that jumps out at us right away is the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, which is found in Isaiah 4:43. And of course, we hear this quote in the New Testament. Who's it talk about? John the Baptist. And John the Baptist repeats this, prepare the way of the Lord. And he's the voice of one crying in the wilderness. So this is John the Baptist, who we call the forerunner, Fore, meaning before. So he's preparing the people for the coming of Christ. So this is a beautiful prophecy teaching us how to prepare for the coming of the Lord. Isaiah, who also prophesies the virgin birth and Emmanuel, which means God is with us, is letting the people know that the coming of Christ is not just the coming Christ is not just a prophet, but God, because Emmanuel, he is with us. All the world must prepare for the coming of Christ, not just mankind, but animals and nature and everything. And we must especially prepare ourselves as humans. Our lives are fleeting, and we must focus on the one who is to come. The prophecy shows Christ as a loving shepherd, but in this prophecy we also get a sense of that God is both tough and hard, but also loving. So the two are not incompatible. God's harshness towards us is his love towards us. Just as a mother or father might punish their children or scold their children, they do it out of love for their child, and God does the same for us. So even we could say, when talking about the last judgment of Christ, which we celebrated yesterday in the church, that's also the way he shows his love for us. But if we just show up once every year, and that's the message we hear, we might get confused and think that God is not loving. But he is in fact very loving, and he shows that through his judgment. Any questions?